Divisive games are very interesting to me. Unlike games that are almost universally hated, divisive games are despised by many but completely loved by others. Let's take a look at some of Nintendo's most divisive games to see if they're actually good, bad, or just in the middle. Nobody who loves Super Mario Sunshine will tell you it's perfect. No one is trying to argue that, but the argument is that the things it does right are so specific and so unrepeatable that the things it does wrong almost don't matter. And the people on the other side will tell you the things it does wrong are so baffling that they ruin the whole experience. Both groups have completely valid points, and the fact that they've been yelling at each other for like 24 years at this point is exactly what makes Sunshine still worth talking about. What this game does better than any other Mario game is make its world feel like somewhere that actually exists. Isle Delfino is a very interesting location with a lot of NPCs, even voice acting for some reason. You could physically see the other locations like Rico Harbor and Pinna Park in the distance, and when you travel to each world, you're physically going there, and it changes how the whole island feels. It's not a collection of levels loosely held together by a hub, but it feels like a real place. The plaza itself is one of the best hub worlds ever made in my opinion. When you first arrive, it's big and slightly confusing, and you're not sure where anything is, but by the end you're moving through it without thinking, cutting across rooftops, diving into the water to skip sections, going underground. Most people love Delfino Plaza. The big thing here is FLUDD, and FLUDD gets blamed for changing how Mario feels, which is quite literally the case, but the conclusion people draw from that it makes him worse, is where I'd push back a little bit. The hover nozzle specifically adds a level of mid-air precision that 64 never had. You can take more aggressive routes because the safety net is there, correct jumps you've already committed to, and once you start combining dives with hover, the movement becomes something a lot better than 64 in my opinion. Now this isn't on the same level as Odyssey, and it does take a little longer to click, but once you actually learn the mechanics, it actually feels really good here. Where it all falls apart is the blue coins, which are one of the worst collectible designs in Nintendo's history, and I won't be taking questions on that. There are 240 of them scattered across every episode of every world. Some only appear in specific versions of the stage, and the game provides exactly 0 tools for tracking which ones you've already found, and the reward for collecting all of these is 24 shine sprites. No special ending, no secret areas, not even a particularly exciting cutscene, just the shine sprites. And again, with no way to track this, it makes it extremely annoying. Mario Odyssey had a lot of collectibles with the purple coins, but those felt a lot fairer to find, and also, you could track them, which is kind of important. And then the No FLUDD secret stages are some of the most divisive levels in one of Nintendo's most divisive games. Some of them are great. The Bianco Hills one with the rotating platforms is well designed. And then there's other levels in this game, like the Pachinko machine. Like, if you've played this game, you know what I'm talking about. The physics in the levels simply do not behave like the rest of the game, and Mario's weight makes no sense in a pinball context. For some reason, Nintendo was obsessed with stuff like this in the 2000s. And then there's the lily pad stage, which is also incredibly annoying, and it feels like the challenge is out of your hand and it's more of a game issue at points, which is not what you want from a 3D platformer. This is kind of the core issue with Sunshine as a whole. It just doesn't feel as polished as other games. And Mario games are also built on the premise that failure teaches you something. Like, when you die in Galaxy or Odyssey, you know exactly what went wrong, and then you try again. But Sunshine has moments where something just happens to you, and you just don't really understand it, like the Pachinko machine. And that unpredictability is what actually frustrates people, not really the difficulty itself, at least in my opinion. But when Sunshine is working, it's doing things no other 3D Mario has done before or since. Noki Bay is one of my favorite levels, and has some really fun climbing sections. Gelato Beach is gorgeous. Shadow Mario chasing you through Delfino Plaza while Piranhas panic around you is a moment that only exists here. And this game also feels like a sandbox like 64 does. It has a lot of fun, unique locations too, like the casino and like the theme park. And for the most part, a lot of the platforming is really fun here. So I played this game for the first time when I was a kid, but I didn't really grow up with it since I didn't finish it until years later. And I feel like if I did play through it as a very young child, then maybe my opinion would be different on it. The game is very flawed in many ways that are hard to excuse, but it's also special in ways that are hard to replicate, and your view on it is going to depend on personal preference here. I tend to think it's a top 10 mainline Mario game. It has a lot of flaws, it's not as polished as you'd like, but I think there's a really fantastic video game here. Now before I continue, I just want to say, if you think any of these divisive games are great, like, subscribe, and comment to let me know. Ask a casual Smash player what they think of Brawl, and ask a competitive player the same question, and you'll get descriptions that sound like two completely different games, and in a meaningful sense, they are. These two groups weren't playing Brawl for the same reasons, weren't hoping for the same things from it, and weren't bothered by the same problems. The gap between their experiences isn't just a matter of preference, but it's completely baked into the design itself, and understanding that is the only way to make sense of why Brawl's reputation is just so all over the place. For the casual side, at the time, Brawl probably was the best Smash game ever made, and the case for that is really strong. The roster felt enormous in 2008, and having Sonic and Snake show up was insane. The soundtrack was amazing, over 300 tracks with composers from across the industry, realistic visuals at the time that Nintendo really pushed, and then of course Subspace, and that does get dismissed sometimes because the platforming is clunky and the generic enemy designs aren't the best, but it does something that no other game in the series has really done, and it's have a full cinematic story mode, actual cutscenes, actual story, and combining all these different characters into one thing was and still is super fun. I know there was Lifelight in Smash Ultimate, but it's not even close to being the same. So this was my first Smash game. This is a game I used to play at friends' house when I was a kid. And playing casually with friends, Brawl is fantastic. It's slower and more chaotic than Melee, it's easier to follow, and it's much more of a party game than the Smash Balls here, which if you use them are complete chaos, and a bunch of other items for casual play. And if you're watching this video, there's a good chance you play Smash competitively, and I have before, but for the average player, especially on the Wii, you think they really cared about all this? The competitive experience is a different story, and it starts with tripping, and for anyone who somehow doesn't know, Brawl has a mechanic where your character randomly falls over mid-dash. There's no input, no warning, nothing that really leads to this, it's literally just RNG, and it's one of the most anti-competitive moves in a game I've ever seen. The game also just feels a lot slower, it just has a lot of spam attacks, and if you actually go back to this to play competitively after playing Smash Wii U or Smash Ultimate, it feels a lot different here. Even beyond all that, it just has floatier physics and combos that are harder to land and easier to escape. And here's the thing, none of that was accidental because Nintendo saw where Melee's competitive scene was heading and made a deliberate choice to go the opposite direction. They wanted Smash to be accessible and chaotic rather than super technical, and commercially that worked because Brawl sold over 13 million copies and the audience it was made for loved it. If you strip away competitive expectations entirely, then Brawl is a really fun game, especially if you're around the same age as me, especially if you grew up playing this at friends' houses. There's a lot to love about Brawl. With that being said, it does deserve its divisive reputation because it made moves to be so anti-competitive. Also Meta Knight, I mean, come on. Origami King doesn't fail the way Sticker Star failed, because Sticker Star felt like the series had lost the thread completely. Thin world design, no interesting characters, a sticker mechanic that turned every battle into a resource question you never wanted to be asking. I actually replayed this recently for a video, and it was miserable. Origami King, on the other hand, is very different. It's much closer to a traditional Paper Mario game, but much closer compared to Paper Mario Sticker Star and Color Splash. Still doesn't mean a lot. I'll get to that, but let's talk about some of the good. Visually, it's one of the best looking Switch games. The paper aesthetic has never been this detailed or this committed, and environments feel physically constructed and layered with paper and cardboard. Like, this game looks fantastic. It goes back to the traditional, more open world, not meaning open world, meaning no world map. There's a much better story here. There's partners, well, kind of. A fantastic soundtrack here, and some more RPG elements, like there's gear here. In my opinion, it is easily the best of the three modern Paper Mario games, but then from there, it starts to fall apart a little bit. The ring battle system is a big issue here. You rotate rings to line up enemies in formations before attacking, and it's a spatial puzzle attached to every fight. And for the first couple of hours, the novelty is there and it works. The problem is it runs out of ideas almost immediately. By hour 3, the solutions feel automatic, and the patterns have repeated enough that you're solving them without thinking. And the bigger issue here is that, like with Sticker Star and like with Color Splash, there's no XP, except you don't get anything out of battling except coins. And in my opinion, that brings this game down a solid 10 to 15 points, because when you want to actively avoid fighting in a turn-based RPG, you're missing out on a lot there. Now, I will actually say that the boss fights are the exception here. You still don't get XP, but it does flip the ring system entirely. Instead of arranging enemies, you're navigating the rings yourself to reach the boss, and dodge attacks. These are actually pretty solid, but again, they're only for bosses. What makes this whole thing frustrating rather than just disappointing is how clearly the rest of the game understands what Paper Mario should be. The world design is interconnected, it looks great, it has fantastic music, and the stretches that feel like the series is finally remembering itself. Then you remember there's still very few unique characters, no environments that really stand out as being out of place like we saw in the Thousand Year Door or Super Paper Mario, no traditional partners outside of a couple that are with you for some time, and a story that still kind of falls flat, pun intended. The reason this game is divisive is because a lot of people really do like it. There's people I've seen have this as their favorite Paper Mario, and there's people like myself who don't really like it very much. I think it's an alright game, but especially after replaying it recently, it just doesn't really stand out to me. New Horizons is impossible to evaluate cleanly without acknowledging what was happening outside of it. The game launched in March 2020, and we all know what was going on then. So New Horizons was a big escape for people who needed some distraction, and New Horizons was that game. I said this in another video, but this was probably the most perfectly timed release of all time, or at least up there, and there's a reason this game has sold a ridiculous amount. The critical reception was also pretty great here, and a lot of that probably was because of the time it came out. What it actually was in those early weeks was great, if not limited. The opening progression of New Horizons is some of the best paced content the series has ever had. Starting from a deserted island with nothing, slowly building a community, unlocking tools and infrastructure, feels rewarding as you would expect from an Animal Crossing game. The customization is the biggest single step forward the series has ever taken, because you can terraform the land itself here, you can place furniture outside, design your island layout down to individual tiles. For people who wanted that level of creative control, and a lot of people did, New Horizons delivers on it. The problem is what the game looked like 6 months later, and once the island is built and the novelty is gone. The older games held up over time because the world had momentum of its own. Villagers in New Leaf had enough personality and dialogue variety that talking to them felt worthwhile months in. There was enough unpredictability that logging in every day felt like you might see something you hadn't seen before. New Horizons stripped almost all of that back, and once you've heard your villagers' dialogue cycle through a couple of rotations, which happened faster than you'd expect, you pretty much heard it all. There was just the daily loops of checking the Nook shopping rotation, digging up fossils, watering some flowers, having the same conversations, and it just started feeling like maintaining a town instead of living in it. It just makes you feel like your normal SpongeBob in that one episode. There's also quite a few missing features when this game came out. There was a ton of missing characters and shops, town ordinances, diving, swimming. There was just a lot here that did not come back from New Leaf. And that really sucked because New Leaf, I think, was the perfect Animal Crossing game. And if New Horizons just built upon that with all of this, it could have been even better. Now, luckily, updates did help with this. Brewster came back, Gyroids returned, new seasonal events got added. There was a big DLC added based on the Happy Home Designer game on the 3DS. And even just a couple months ago, we got a Switch 2 version with more content, as well as an update for the Nintendo Switch version. The game is objectively much better now than when it launched, but like every game on this list, it still is very controversial. New Horizons did a lot of things well, but it also just missed out on a lot of content, and had the villagers take a big step back. Personally, for me, I really like this game. It's not close to New Leaf in my opinion, but it also depends on your preference. If you were looking for a more sandbox style game, you'll really like New Horizons most likely. If you're looking for more of a sim, then maybe the older games are more your style. Black and White went from one of the most contested entries in the franchise to one of the most respected, and the shift happened gradually enough that it's easy to forget how messy the initial reception actually was. So this game was huge when it came out. As someone who grew up in the DS era, everyone talked about this. I can't tell you how many times I saw people playing this in school. So let's talk about the game itself. The Pokédex restriction was the first fight. You could only use new Pokemon until the post-game, no exceptions, no access to the hundreds of familiar ones people had built teams around for years. For a lot of players, that felt alienating, because there's real comfort in knowing you can fall back on something familiar, and just taking that away made the game feel disconnected from everything the series had built up to that point. The new designs took a beating too. Trubbish is a living garbage bag, Vanillite is an ice cream cone, the Game Break is running out of ideas discourse that still circulates to this day, basically originated with these two specifically, which is a little funny in retrospect given that the Gen 1 Pokemon gave us a Pokemon that's literally just a ball with eyes and another one that's a magnet, but still that discourse stuck. However, what that restriction actually accomplished is worth taking seriously though. Unova's regional dex is 156 Pokemon, and it's one of the strongest single generation lineups the series had ever produced. Haxorus, Hydreigon, Chandelure, Golurk, Bisharp, Crocodile. There's a lot of variety here that fits a lot of different playstyles, and it forces people to engage with what was actually in front of you rather than defaulting to the same 6 you'd used since childhood, so it does make the game feel fresh. The story is also another thing that's aged well. Black and White is one of the only mainline games that commits to a real narrative identity and sees it through. The central conflict explores whether using Pokemon as battle companions can be ethically justified, which hits differently when you've been playing these games your whole life and never stopped to question it, and is the reason it works because he's not a villain in any conventional sense. He's a lot more philosophical than just your typical cartoonishly over-the-top bad guy. I think he's just one of the more interesting characters in this series, and if you played this as a kid you might not have even noticed. The rival dynamic is another underrated part of the game. Sharon and Bianca aren't rivals in the traditional sense. They have their own goals and have nothing to do with you. Sharon spends the whole game chasing the idea that being champion because he thinks strength is the point, and slowly realizes the title means nothing without knowing why he wanted it. Bianca figures out partway through that being a trainer isn't what she actually wants from her life and pivots to working with Professor Juniper instead. The post-game is also worth mentioning because it's one of the most substantial in the series. After the credits, the entire eastern half of Unova unlocks, new areas, tougher trainers, a whole second stretch of content that most players don't fully explore. Is it as divisive now? Not as much. I think a lot of people have grown to appreciate this. But also there is Black 2 and White 2, which are critically much more popular games. The region is pretty linear, and the heavy story focus is something a lot of people just don't care for from a Pokemon game, so that is why this game can be seen as divisive. And also I just want to point out that so many Pokemon games are divisive, but I decided to go with Black and White because I feel like it's kind of like a love it or hate it type game. With the Nintendo Switch games, they are certainly divisive, but I feel like there are just a lot more negative opinions on them than positive. Skyward Sword contains some of the best dungeon design in the history of Zelda, and also a companion who will constantly interrupt you. These two things exist in the same game, and that kind of explains the whole game at the same time. There's a lot of great here, and just a lot of moments that make you go, why? The dungeons are excellent and deserve to be said that way. Ancient Cistern is built around the contrast between a serene, Buddhist-inspired upper level and a grotesque flooded basement full of the undead. And aesthetically and mechanically, it's a great dungeon. In fact, I'd say it's one of the most cohesive single dungeons in the series. Lanayru mining facility uses small orbs called timeshift stones that restore the surrounding area to its ancient past. Activating one in a crumbling ruin suddenly reveals functional conveyor belts and machinery around you, and that's a real really fun concept. Like, these aren't just good Zelda dungeons. In my opinion, they are some of the best in the series. And they also kind of carry the game. And that's because the overworld surrounding those dungeons is where things fracture. Quite literally, because they are completely fractured. They're not one cohesive, interconnected world. The game uses 3 main surface regions, which are the Faron Woods, Elden Volcano, and Lanayru Desert, that you revisit multiple times across the campaign with different objectives each time. The idea is that familiarity reveals new layers, that going back to spaces with new tools open things up that weren't accessible before. But in practice, the 3rd time you're moving through Faron Woods, including once when the area gets flooded, it just has you getting a little bored and starts to feel like padding. Now, some people like this. I don't think it's as bad as something like the Temple of the Ocean King, but it's definitely not my favorite design in the series. And then the motion controls are something that I'd say a lot more people have negative views on. They do work most of the time. They're not the worst thing ever, but the Wii Remote wasn't really as accurate as you would like from this. Girahim's first fight is the best showcase, because he catches your sword if you swing in the same direction twice, so you actually have to think about the angle of every attack. Now, the combat can actually feel pretty fun when it's actually working, but when it's not, and that's going to be a lot, even the Switch Remaster, which doesn't enforce motion controls, still feels very awkward using the right stick for the sword. In my opinion, that is the biggest issue with the game. It is something that you can get used to, but you're never going to fully ignore. Another one of the biggest issues is Fi, or Fi as some people like to say. Fi is just a bad companion. She will explain in detail that a locked door probably requires a key. She will appear every time you solved a puzzle to walk you through what the puzzle was asking. She will interrupt exploration to tell you your battery is low. She analyzes everything with percentage-based confidence ratings that communicate nothing useful. Like, I calculate a 67% chance that this dungeon contains treasure. And this is coming after Twilight Princess, which had maybe the best companion in the series, but there are more positives here that I do want to mention. The story is one of the series' better ones, and it was really cool to see this old version of Hyrule at the beginning of the timeline. And the characters here have a lot more personality, and of course this Zelda you know personally, so that gives the quest more stakes here. I'd say Skyward Sword has some really high highs, but some really low lows. And your experience just comes down to how much some of these things will actually bother you and how much you appreciate certain game design aspects. Almost everyone who has played Three Houses agrees it's good, and that's actually part of what makes the conversation around it interesting, because the divisiveness isn't about whether it works, it's about whether the ambition fully pays off, whether the game holds up to being experienced multiple times, which is more or less what it's designed for. The characters are the foundation of this. The house system works because instead of recruiting a large cast gradually across a long campaign, you spend the first half of the game in real sustained contact with a core group of people. You learn their histories through support conversations, understanding dynamics between them, watch how they develop, and when the story splits at the midpoint and you find yourself opposing people you spent 30 hours training, it does actually land. Now, for this video, I asked some Fire Emblem fans, since I'm not a big Fire Emblem expert, but according to them, Edelgard, Dimitri, and Claude are 3 of the best written characters in the series, and what makes them work is that the game lets all 3 of their perspectives be coherent and understandable. There's no route where you pick the obvious correct leader, and every path has a version of the conflict that makes sense on its own terms, and writing that across the different routes without any of them feeling like the wrong answer is something Three Houses pulls off better than it probably had any right to. The monastery is where things get complicated, and specifically complicated in the context of replaying. The concept is smart. It's a central hub where you build relationships with your students, manage their development week by week, make choices that shape your army over time, and the first playthrough works, but the problem is the game essentially requires multiple playthroughs to see everything it's doing, and the monastery just doesn't hold up to that at all. By the second route, you've sprinted through the same hallways, clicking through the same conversations, fishing in the same pond for support points, sitting through choir practice and greenhouse maintenance, and every other monthly routine before the game lets you get back to the battles. A lot of this might feel charming at first, but it wears over time. Then the game also tries to do too much. It feels like it's trying to appeal both casual and more hardcore fans without fully satisfying each. Then the route structure has a specific problem that doesn't get talked about enough. Verdant Wind and Silver Snow, the Golden Deer and Church routes, they share almost the entire second half. The maps are just the same and the chapter beats are the same. Structure's nearly identical. And from a gameplay standpoint, you're playing a significant portion of the game twice with minor variations, and that can bring down the experience. The combat and class system stay strong throughout, which matters, but also, like I mentioned, feels like it's trying to find a balance between hardcore and casual, but doesn't really hit for either side as much as they would like. This is a very interesting game to talk about, because I feel like a lot of people can recognize how it's a well-made game, and maybe even objectively better than other Fire Emblem games in a lot of ways, but also subjectively a lot works, if that makes sense. Also, the anime art style is very divisive. This is the Fire Emblem game that really pushed this forward more, and I'm personally not a fan of it. The original Luigi's Mansion is a game about being inside a haunted mansion. And that sounds obvious, but it matters, because Dark Moon is a game about completing missions inside several haunted mansions, and the difference between those two things is the entire reason the sequel has been divisive since it came out. What makes the original work is that you stay in this mansion the whole time, you slowly learn the layout, develop a sense of how every room connects, and go deeper into the mansion. The game never breaks the continuity, and the atmosphere is just perfect here. Dark Moon replaces that with a mission structure across 5 separate mansions. There's a Gloomy Manor, Haunted Towers, Old Clockwork, Secret Mine, and Treacherous Mansion. and they all have distinct identities and more mechanical variety, as well as more creative puzzles across the environments. Scare is also a great addition and something I played a ton as a kid. You can play this with friends and go through randomized floors, hunting keys and clearing ghost waves before the timer runs out, and that mode is extremely replayable even today. But the mission structure changes what exploration feels like in a way that just can't be worked around. When you drop into a mansion with a specific objective completed and get pulled back to Egad's lab before you could look at anything else, it takes away a lot of that exploration. There's no rooms you find by wandering because every visit is built around something specific you're supposed to find, and anything outside that scope gets saved for a different mission in a different section. Dark Moon is a well-made game full of good ideas, but it's one of those games that very much feels like a handheld game, where it wants to be played in short bursts instead of just being like this grander adventure. And finally, I want to talk about Mario Kart World. So this game is not even a year old now, and people are still trying to decide how to rank it. There was a ton of hype with this, especially being an $80 game, being a launch game with the Nintendo Switch 2, and being an open world Mario Kart game. Like, that sounds awesome, and the hype was unreal for this. But for a lot of people, it was extremely disappointing. It had so many good ideas that just weren't fully developed. Previous games were just collections of tracks in different cups, but in here you drive freely between locations, and the environment transitions you as you move from one track to another, and that seemed to be a really cool idea. But the issue with the open world here is that it's just kind of empty. It might look cool, but there's not really much to do. You could find some costumes, you could find P-switches, but that's pretty much it. There's not really any challenges, there's no other online racers, no missions or anything. Look at something like Forza Horizon. It's another open world racing game, and there's a ton to do in these worlds. There's a lot to find. And World could have done something like that, but it just didn't. Now, the driving here is really fun. There's a lot more you can do. You could go on rails, you can do more tricks, but one of the most annoying parts of this game comes down to there being 24 races here instead of 12. In modes like Knockout Tour, you can go from 1st to 24th in a matter of seconds, because there's just so many items being thrown, and that's actually a bad thing to be in first, because you're just going to get blue shelled and attacked with everything, and that's not what you want from a Mario Kart game. There's always going to be a target on who's in first place, but it shouldn't feel like a curse. Beyond that, there's intermission tracks, which have gotten a little better, but they're still not great, and there's just not too much to do. There's an alright battle mode, there's a Grand Prix, Knockout Tour, but there's just so much more potential here, especially in the free room where there's almost nothing to do. I thought it was going to be something I could sink hours into, but it's something I could barely sink a few minutes into without getting bored. Now, Mario Kart World is still a fairly new game, and I do think that it will get better. I think there'll be updates, I think there'll be DLC for this game, but as of now, it definitely deserves to be divisive. And Nintendo kind of did it to themselves with the $80 price tag, because when you're charging $20 more than your average game, at least for Nintendo at the time, you're going to have sky-high expectations, and those expectations fell flat for a lot of people. So those are just a few divisive games I wanted to go over. There's a ton of divisive Nintendo games, and if you want, I can cover more in another video. Let me know which ones you'd want to see. But for all of these games, I don't think a single one is bad. I think all of them have a lot of things to love, but they do have some pretty big flaws that are hard to ignore. And the only thing that really matters when it comes to these games, or any game, is it doesn't matter what someone else thinks. If the game is seen as divisive, but you love it, then it doesn't matter. You love that game, and that's all that should matter to you. So don't let a game's reputation affect your opinion of it. So if you made it to the end of this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out some of these videos on screen, and also consider joining my Discord. I'll see you next time.